Hey everyone, Greg Cazillo from Cazillo.com. I have wanted for quite some time to redo my exposure video. So here it is. Let's go over the very basics of every single image that you create. You need to be thinking about your exposure. That's your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO for every single image that you're taking, or at least a group of images, and then reset and check it again. Let's go over some of the very basics. Even if you think you have a pretty good grasp of it, there's a good chance that you'll take something away from this video and you'll be able to improve your photography in some way. The goal of this, of course, is for you to get better, for you to be able to create better photographs. In order to create better photographs, you need to understand how they're created. The first thing that I always set in my camera every single time I'm constantly thinking about is my aperture. The aperture is the amount of light that is coming through your lens, that is passing through that lens. The way it's controlled is through a diaphragm that opens and closes inside of the lens, and that's called our aperture. Now, some lenses are able to go to f2.8, which is a lot of light. Most, or just about all lenses, can go down to f22, which is just a little bit of light. Not only does the aperture control the amount of light coming in, it also controls our depth of field. At 2.8, or a smaller number, we get a shallower depth of field. F22, we get a deeper depth of field, where we get everything in focus. Why am I setting the aperture first and thinking about my aperture first before the shutter speed and before the ISO? Number one, the aperture, at least in my opinion, has the most control over the final image composition. Yeah, the shutter speed makes a difference, but you know what? The aperture really sets the tone for the entire photograph, makes a huge difference, controls focus, which is the primary thing that you need, is a good sharp focus in order to create a good photo, and of course good exposure. That all goes hand in hand, and then your composition as well. So first thing, I'm always setting and thinking about my aperture. All right, so we have amount of light and that depth of field at 2.8, f4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22. Those are our major stops. All right, you're going to have stops in between these. In fact, you're going to have stops in between all of these settings, from your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. You're going to have settings in between each of those, okay? But these are your major stops, or your full stops. Not all of your lenses are going to be able to support each of those stops. And also keep in mind that in less expensive lenses or kit lenses, when you zoom in, you're going to lose about a stop, maybe a stop and a third of light when you zoom in. Actually, in my opinion, I think the camera manufacturers are doing you a disservice by giving you a lesser lens, because it makes it harder. You don't quite understand what's going on, and when you're trying to shoot manual and learn, you just don't get it. It just doesn't quite click that when you zoom in, you're losing light and your aperture is changing, and of course you're not seeing that change inside of the lens. So in my opinion, I just think they're doing a disservice, and I think they should change it. Anyway, aperture always set first. Number two is our shutter speed, or the amount of time. So if you want to turn this into a different analogy, think about this as a fire hose, okay? We have a fire hose, and it's going to fill, the light is actually water coming out of the fire engine, all right? And so our aperture is like the bail on the hose, all right? We can control the amount of light or the amount of water coming out of that hose by opening and closing the bail on that fire hose, or on the nozzle on the very end. The shutter speed is now the time. How long am I going to leave that open? All right. If we start out at, say, a 1/15th of a second, that's a pretty slow shutter speed, but then we can go all the way up to a 1/1000th, 1/2000th, 1/8000th of a second. That's a very small amount of time, which means that our subject is going to be stopped, or our motion is going to be stopped. When I'm waving my hand like this, you can probably stop the motion at about a 1/125th of a second, maybe a 1/250th of a second. That's plenty of time to stop that motion and get rid of any blur in that image. But if I'm waving my hand like this and you're shooting around a 1/15th of a second, you're definitely going to see a little bit of ghosting around my fingers in my hand. And so you might want to stop that. So you need to think about it. Or you might not want to stop it. Maybe you want to, leave that blur. So it's all in how you want to compose the image, where you choose your shutter speed. So we learned about our amount, we've learned about our time. The last one is the capacity. So we go back to that fire hose or that water analogy. All right, how long is the water gonna take to fill up a big, huge like swimming pool or a 55-gallon drum or maybe a little glass of water? Okay. If we start out at say 100 ISO, that's going to be a huge amount of water. It's basically the sensitivity of the sensor is very low, which means you have a very big bucket. You need a lot of light in order to fill that bucket, that big, huge drum. All right. Then the opposite of that is ISO 6400, which is the other threshold, which is a very small amount of water. It's like a little bucket or say maybe a little container of water. You just need a little bit of light in order to fill it, but at the expense of noise, and you get a little bit of grain, a little bit of noise in certain sensors. Obviously, the newer the camera, the better the quality of that sensor, so you're not going to have as much noise, as much grain. In my opinion, don't worry about it. It's not something that, if you can create a great photograph, it really does not matter what your ISO is set at. If you have a good exposure, if you're exposing properly, using your histogram, checking to make sure that everything is set properly, and you're basically filling that bucket up as much as possible without going over, because if you go over, then you could be overexposing and have too much light. So that's something you need to think about too. But just create the photograph, get a good composition, compose it well, choose the right settings, and that's what matters. The engineers are basically saying to you, look, we're doing the best we can with the amount of light that you are giving it, okay? That's the quality. That's their end of it. If you want to lower your ISO, then you need to shoot at a different time of day. You need to add more light into the scene. Maybe you need to introduce a flash. So there are other ways to add more light so that you can lower your ISO. But if you don't have a choice of adding more light or changing the time of day, shoot what you can, set your ISO, don't worry about it. A couple more small points about this. Obviously on the scale here, on the left side of the scale, you have your more light, 2.8, 1/15th of a second, or the bigger bucket at ISO 100. On the right side is a less light, f/22, 1/1000th of a second, or 6400 is that smaller bucket that you need to fill. Also keep in mind that when you go from one stop to the next, going from left to right, say from f5.6 to f8, you have halved the amount of light. All right, go from 5.6 to f8, you cut the amount of light in half. The other way, if you go from say 1/250th of a second to a 1/125th of a second, you have doubled the amount of light. So in a scene, say you're at f8, 1/125th of a second at ISO 800, and you say to yourself, well, I really want a little bit shallower depth of field for this photograph. So let's go to f4, change our aperture to f4. Now we're going to let in more light, so now we're at f4 at a 1/125th of a second at ISO 800. We have a little bit of motion. We're shooting photos of kids, okay? So we're overexposing by 2 stops. We don't want to change our shutter speed, so the easy thing to do is just change our ISO down and adjust it down by 2 stops. Go from 800 down to 200, and then we still have a nice normal exposure. Our bucket is full to the brim. We don't have to worry about underexposure. It looks good. It's got plenty of light, plenty of color, and we still get that equal amount. One more point that I wanted to make about this is that you'll see that 1/60th of a second is underlined. That's kind of your bottom level to make sure that your photos are still sharp and don't have any camera blur. It's not necessarily a focus thing. It's kind of a blur from basically not holding the camera steady enough, because under a 30th, a 15th of a second, basically under a 60th, you can very easily have just a tiny little bit of motion from breathing, from any kind of thing, from getting bumped, and it's a longer amount of time, which means that your photos can have a little bit of a blur to them, and they won't be tack sharp. So over time, you can definitely get better at it, get down to a 30th, down to a 15th, or an 1/8 or a 1/4 of a second. One of these days, I'll make another video showing you some tricks on how to handhold at some of those slower shutter speeds. The number one thing that I can tell you right now is watch this video right here, which tells you how to hold your camera properly. Make sure you are doing it correctly. Thanks, guys. Keep shooting. See ya.